Rain dripped from the eaves of my small wooden home, the steady pitter-patter filling the quiet night. The clock on the wall ticked away monotonously, marking the late hours, almost midnight. Outside, the narrow streets of our sleepy Japanese town were deserted, washed clean by the downpour. My tea had grown cold as I scrolled through my phone, trying to fight off the peculiar sense of unease that had clung to me all evening. Then came the knock. It was soft at first, almost imperceptible, like the hesitant touch of a child. I froze. My neighbors were elderly, early sleepers who wouldn't dare brave the rain this late. The thought of a stranger out there in this weather sent a shiver up my spine. The knock came again, louder this time, echoing through the silence of the house. My first thought was that it could be a delivery mistake, though no one delivered packages at this hour. My second thought? Something I didn't want to say out loud. Standing, I reached for the umbrella propped by the door, not to use it but to grip it like a weapon. With each step toward the front entrance, my unease grew. The wooden floor creaked beneath my feet as I approached the source of the noise. Through the frosted glass of the door, I saw two small shapes. Children. What on earth were children doing here in this rain so late at night? My hand hesitated over the lock. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice steadier than I expected. No reply. Instead, a third knock, sharper this time, pierced the air. "Please," came a small voice, muffled but urgent. "Let us in. We're lost." A chill crawled up my spine. I peered closer, my breath fogging the glass. Two children stood on the narrow porch, a boy and a girl, their heads slightly lowered. They looked no older than 10, soaked to the bone, water dripping from their hair onto the wood beneath their feet. It was strange though. Despite the storm, their voices didn't sound wet. There was no gasp of cold air, no chatter of teeth. Just that quiet, steady plea, "Let us in." My instinct screamed at me to stay behind the door, to not engage. But their smallness, their vulnerability, it tugged at something human, something maternal inside me. "Why are you out in the rain? Where are your parents?" I asked, my hand still hovering over the lock. "They're not here," the boy said, his tone flat. "We've been walking for hours. Please let us inside. We need help." And then silence. Even the rain seemed to pause as I stood there, frozen in indecision. A voice in the back of my head whispered, "This isn't right. Don't do it." But how could I turn away children in the middle of the night? It was then, as I reached for the door, that a thought occurred to me, a thought I couldn't ignore. How did they know someone was home? My house was dark, all the lights off except the dim glow of my phone. There was no reason for anyone to knock here, no reason for these children to know I was awake. My fingers tightened on the umbrella. "Before we go any further, let me ask you this. What would you do? Would you open the door to children, cold and scared in the rain? Or would you trust that nagging feeling in your gut telling you something was wrong? If you're as intrigued as I was in that moment, let's make a pact. Hit that like button and subscribe to my channel. You won't want to miss what happens next. Trust me, this story only gets darker from here." Now where was I? Ah yes, the knock. When I finally opened the door, I saw them clearly for the first time. And that's when I realized, they weren't ordinary children. The door creaked open, revealing the two children fully. My porch light buzzed faintly, casting a weak yellow glow over the drenched pair. They stood unnaturally still, their heads slightly bowed, their dark hair plastered to their pale faces by the rain. The boy was taller, maybe around 10 years old, with a narrow frame and clothes that hung awkwardly on his thin body. Beside him was a smaller girl, clutching the edge of her oversized coat with trembling hands. Despite the storm, they didn't shiver. They didn't fidget. They just stood there. "Can we come in?" the boy asked, his voice devoid of the desperation I'd expected from lost children. It was calm. Too calm. I don't know," I stammered, gripping the doorframe as a sense of unease swelled in my chest. "Where are your parents? Do you live nearby?" The boy raised his head slightly, just enough for me to see his lips curl into a small, almost mechanical smile. "They're not here," he said simply. "We've been walking for so long. Please let us in. We're cold and we're hungry." The girl finally moved, her chin lifting just enough for her face to catch the light. Her skin was ghostly pale, her cheeks devoid of the healthy flush I'd expect from a child. She didn't say a word, but her eyes, no, not her eyes, something else entirely, seemed to bore into me. My breath caught in my throat. I couldn't see her pupils or the whites of her eyes. They were completely black, like staring into the void. I stepped back instinctively, nearly slamming the door shut. But the boy spoke again, his tone soft, almost hypnotic. "We won't stay long. Just a little while. Please." His words lingered in the air, unnatural in their precision. A sharp chill cut through me, though I couldn't decide if it was the cold air or something more sinister. "You can't stay here," I finally managed, my voice firmer now. "But I can call someone to help you." "The police, maybe?" "No," the boy's response came immediately, almost cutting off my words. "No police. No one else. Just you." The girl tilted her head slightly, her lips parting as if to say something, but the boy raised a hand, silencing her. His movements were precise, controlled like a puppet on strings. "It's raining. We're cold. Please," he repeated. The word please hung heavy in the air, carrying an unnatural weight. I felt as though my body wasn't entirely my own anymore, as if something unseen was pushing me to act against my better judgment. My hand hovered over the door handle, my mind racing. Logic screamed at me to shut the door, to lock it and call someone for help. But there was something magnetic about the children. Despite the fear crawling up my spine, I couldn't look away from their empty, black eyes. The boy leaned forward slightly, his wet hair dripping onto the floor just inside the doorway. "You don't want to leave us out here, do you?" The question wasn't innocent. It was a statement, a declaration that tugged at some primal part of my mind. My lips parted to respond, but the words wouldn't come. And then the girl finally spoke. Her voice was barely a whisper, yet it carried over the sound of the rain with an unnatural clarity. "If you don't let us in, you'll regret it." The air in the room shifted, growing heavy and suffocating. The porch light flickered, casting strange shadows across their small faces. For a moment I considered giving in. But something deep within me resisted, some instinct that screamed I was standing on the edge of a precipice. The boy tilted his head now, mimicking the girl's earlier motion. "What's wrong?" he asked, his voice dripping with mock innocence. "We just need a little help. Just a little." Every hair on my body stood on end. I knew in that moment, these weren't children. They couldn't be. What would you have done? Let them in? Slammed the door? My hand trembled as I stood frozen in the doorway, caught between fear and the inexplicable pull of their presence. I can tell you what I did next, but before we get there, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to my channel. Stories like this aren't easy to share, but trust me, it only gets darker from here. Now back to the story. The next words from the boy would haunt me forever. I stood there in the doorway, caught between the unrelenting rain outside and the oppressive silence that hung between us. The children didn't move except to blink in slow, deliberate intervals, their soaked clothes clinging to their frail frames. Despite their stillness, they radiated a presence that felt far larger than their small bodies. The boy was the first to step forward, placing one foot inside the threshold. His shoe left a wet print on the floor, but I barely noticed. My eyes were locked on his face, on his unervingly blank expression. "Please," he said again, tilting his head upward just enough to catch the light. For the first time, I got a clear look at his face. And then I saw them, his eyes. My breath hitched. There were no whites, no irises. Just black. Endless black, like staring into a void that stretched on forever. It wasn't just unnatural, it was wrong, deeply and inherently wrong. I stumbled back a step, my hand gripping the doorframe to steady myself. What's wrong with your eyes?" I blurted out, the words tumbling from my lips before I could stop them. The boy didn't answer. He didn't flinch or react in any way that a normal child would. Instead, he simply turned his head slightly to the side, his expression unreadable. The girl spoke then, her voice soft but piercing. "We're just tired. Don't you want to help us?" Her gaze met mine, and for a brief moment I thought maybe I'd imagined it. Maybe the dim porch light was casting shadows, or my own exhaustion was playing tricks on me. But when she shifted, the light caught her eyes as well, those same empty black orbs. The world around me seemed to tilt. The soft hum of the rain faded into the background as an overwhelming sense of dread settled over me. I had seen strange things before, things that defied explanation, but nothing had ever struck fear into me like this. "You need to leave," I said, my voice trembling. I can't help you." The boy didn't move. His head tilted slightly, his black eyes locked on mine. "We can't leave," he said, his tone eerily calm. "Not until you let us in." The girl stepped closer now, her small hand reaching out to touch the edge of the door. "We won't hurt you," she whispered. "We just need to come inside." The words hung in the air like a threat disguised as a plea. My body screamed at me to close the door, to lock it, to do something. But I couldn't move. It was as if their gaze pinned me in place, draining the strength from my limbs. "Why are your eyes like that?" I asked, the words barely audible over the pounding of my heart. The boy's lips curled into a smile, small and sharp. "You're imagining things," he said. "We're just children. You're not going to leave us out here, are you? For a moment I questioned myself. Maybe I was imagining things. Maybe exhaustion and fear were warping my perception. But as the girl shifted closer, her eyes catching the faint glow of the porch light once more, I knew the truth. Those eyes weren't human. Suddenly, the lights inside the house flickered, plunging the room into brief darkness before the warm glow returned. It was enough to snap me out of my paralysis. I took a step back, my hand reaching for the edge of the door. "I'm sorry," I said, my voice firmer now, though fear still trembled beneath the surface. "I can't help you." The boy's smile vanished, replaced by a blank, unreadable expression. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then, as if on cue, they both stepped back into the rain. But before I could shut the door, the girl looked up one last time, her black eyes shimmering with something that looked almost like anger or hunger. "You'll regret this," she said softly. And then they were gone. I slammed the door shut, my breath hitching as I twisted the lock. The heavy clunk of the bolt sliding into place should have brought relief, but it didn't. Instead, the house seemed quieter than it should have been, the steady hum of the rain outside muffled as if the world had suddenly shrunk. I stood there for a moment, hands still gripping the doorknob, trying to steady my breathing. My heart hammered in my chest, loud enough that I was sure they could hear it from the other side of the door. "Let us in." The voice wasn't loud, but it was close, too close. My stomach dropped as I realized it came from just beyond the door. I staggered back, staring at the wood as if it might burst open at any second. "You're making a mistake," the boy said, his voice calm but now laced with something darker, a quiet authority that sent a shiver down my spine. "We only need a little help." A soft, rhythmic knock began again, this time slower, more deliberate. Tap, tap, tap. My legs felt weak as I backed further into the house, my mind racing. Something was wrong, so deeply, fundamentally wrong. The air itself felt heavier, pressing down on me like an invisible weight. It wasn't just fear, it was as though the house was alive, the walls leaning closer, suffocating me with their presence. "We don't want to hurt you," the girl said, her voice a sing-song mockery of innocence. "But you're making this harder than it has to be." The lights flickered again, buzzing faintly before plunging the room into darkness. My breath caught, and I stumbled, reaching blindly for the flashlight on the nearby counter. I fumbled with the switch, and when it finally clicked on, the weak beam illuminated the room in shaky bursts. "You can't hide from us." The boy's voice was sharper now, his calmness replaced with something harder, more demanding. Suddenly, there was a loud thud against the door. I jumped, nearly dropping the flashlight, its beam bouncing wildly across the room. My mind screamed at me to move, to run, to do something, but my body felt frozen in place. "Let us in." The girl's voice rang out, shrill and piercing now, and I swear it wasn't coming from outside anymore. It sounded closer, inside. I spun around, aiming the flashlight at the room behind me. Nothing. Just the faint outlines of furniture and shadows stretching where they shouldn't. The air grew colder, each breath leaving a visible puff in front of me. The knocking had stopped, but a new sound took its place. A faint scratching like nails dragging across the wood. It started low, near the bottom of the door, then slowly crept upward. "Don't make this worse for yourself," the boy said again, his voice unrelenting, now dripping with venom. And then came the laughter. Quiet at first, a soft giggle from the girl, but it grew, rising in pitch and intensity until it echoed around me, filling every corner of the room. I clamped my hands over my ears, trying to block it out, but it was inside my head, a jagged sound that tore through my thoughts. "Leave me alone," I screamed, finally finding my voice. For a moment there was silence. Just the rain outside and the sound of my own ragged breathing. I dared to take a step forward, aiming the flashlight back at the door. "Is that really what you want?" the boy asked, his voice now low, guttural, almost inhuman. I froze. My pulse thundered in my ears as the door handle began to rattle violently, the sound reverberating through the small house. I stumbled backward, tripping over the edge of the rug, the flashlight slipping from my hands and clattering to the floor. The beam landed on the window across the room and my heart nearly stopped. There they were. Both of them, standing in the rain, their faces pressed against the glass. Their black eyes glinted in the faint light, wide and unblinking, their smile stretching too far, too sharp. "We're not going anywhere," the girl whispered, her voice cutting through the glass as if it wasn't there. I scrambled to my feet, panic clawing at my throat. I didn't know what they were or what they wanted, but I knew one thing for certain. I was not safe. Their faces pressed against the rain-streaked glass, black eyes glinting in the weak beam of my flashlight, as if the very darkness inside them was alive. The boy tilted his head, his lips curling into a smile that stretched just a little too wide. Beside him, the girl raised her hand and lightly tapped the glass. Once, twice, 3 times. The sound was soft, but it cut through the oppressive silence like a knife. "We don't want to hurt you," the boy said, his voice muffled by the window. "We just need to come in. You're the only one who can help us." My breath hitched, my thoughts racing in chaotic loops. I didn't know what they were or where they had come from, but they were persistent, relentless. And yet, despite the overwhelming dread that made my hands tremble and my legs weak, there was something in their voices, something faintly human. "You're just kids," I whispered, more to myself than to them. The girl smiled now, her teeth flashing in the dim light. "Yes, just kids. We're lost. We're cold. Let us in." The words carried a weight I couldn't explain, a pull that tugged at the edges of my mind. I gripped the flashlight tighter, my knuckles whitening. Fear screamed at me to leave the door locked, to never let them cross the threshold. But another part of me, a quieter, more human part, hesitated. What if I was wrong? What if they really were just children? They looked young, vulnerable, soaked to the bone in the relentless rain. I thought about the stories my grandmother used to tell, warnings about spirits that wandered in the guise of children. But those were just myths, weren't they? The boy's voice broke through my thoughts, soft and measured. "We don't have anywhere else to go. You're the only one who can save us." I swallowed hard, my throat dry. The storm outside roared louder, the wind howling like a wounded animal, and the lights inside flickered again. A part of me knew that if I opened the door, I wouldn't just be letting in 2 lost children. I would be inviting in something far worse. But their faces, their voices. The girl pressed her palm to the window now, leaving a faint smudge on the glass. "Please," she said, her tone almost desperate. My grip on the flashlight faltered. Was it empathy? Was it fear? Or was it something else entirely that made me reach for the door? "No," I muttered, shaking my head. I stepped back from the window, trying to steady my breathing. "You can't come in." For a moment there was silence. The girl lowered her hand, her face unreadable. The boy's smile faded, replaced by an expression so blank it sent chills crawling up my spine. "You'll regret this," he said flatly. His voice was no longer soft or pleading, it was cold, mechanical. The girl stepped back from the glass, her black eyes never leaving mine. "You don't understand," she said quietly, almost sadly. "You've already made your choice." And just like that, they were gone. I blinked, the flashlight shaking in my hands. I swung the beam toward the window, but there was nothing there, no faces, no shapes. The rain continued to pour, but the children had vanished as if they'd never been there. Relief began to seep into my chest, but it was fleeting. A sudden noise behind me, like a sharp breath, made my blood run cold. I spun around, the flashlight's beam bouncing wildly off the walls, illuminating nothing but empty space. Then came the knock. Not at the door this time. It came from inside the house. I froze, every muscle in my body locking into place. The sound came again, louder now, echoing through the narrow hallway that led to the back of the house. "No," I whispered, backing away slowly. My mind raced, trying to make sense of the impossible. They couldn't have gotten inside. I hadn't let them in. Had I? The knock echoed again, hollow and deliberate, sending a shiver crawling up my spine. It came from the back of the house, where there were no doors, no windows large enough for anyone to enter. My breath caught, and the flashlight trembled in my grip as the oppressive silence thickened around me, wrapping me in a cocoon of dread. "They're gone," I whispered to myself, more a prayer than a statement. "They're gone." I forced my legs to move, taking small, hesitant steps toward the source of the sound. The hallway stretched before me, darker than it had ever seemed before, the shadows creeping like living things along the walls. But the knock came again, louder this time, closer. My heart pounded as I stopped just outside the bedroom door. It was open, swinging slightly on its hinges as if coaxing me forward. The sound wasn't coming from behind it, though. No, it was deeper, inside my head now, a rhythmic pulse that matched the racing beat of my heart. "They're gone," I repeated, trying to convince myself, but the words felt hollow. I swung the flashlight's beam into the room, scanning the space. Everything was in its place. The bed, the dresser, the curtains swaying slightly in the draft. But the air was different, heavier, charged with something unseen but undeniable. That I saw it. On the floor near the foot of the bed was a single wet footprint. Small. Too small. My chest tightened as I followed its trail, one print after another leading to the corner of the room, where the shadows seemed darker than they should have been. "Why did you do this?" a voice whispered. I spun around, nearly dropping the flashlight. The voice was soft, almost childlike, but it carried an edge that sliced through the air like a blade. "You should have let us in," came another voice, this one sharper, colder. The beam of light wavered as I swung it toward the hallway again, and my heart nearly stopped. Standing there, at the far end of the corridor, were the children. Their heads tilted, their black eyes gleaming like polished stone. "No," I muttered, stepping back into the bedroom. My foot landed on something wet, and I glanced down to see another footprint. This one larger, shaped like an adult's, but still unfamiliar. The boy stepped forward, his movements unnervingly smooth, almost gliding across the floor. "You can't escape," he said softly. "It's too late now." My back hit the wall as I clutched the flashlight, its beam flickering and dimming as if the batteries were being drained by their presence. "Stay away," I shouted, but my voice wavered, weak even to my own ears. The girl appeared beside the boy, her black eyes reflecting the faint light like twin voids. "You didn't listen," she said, her tone flat, devoid of any emotion. "You'll regret it." And then everything went dark. When I woke up, the house was still. The rain had stopped, the air thick with the scent of damp wood and something metallic, like blood. My head throbbed, and my memory felt fragmented, as though someone had taken a knife to it and sliced away pieces at random. The flashlight lay beside me, dead, its glass cracked. I pushed myself up from the floor, noticing for the first time the strange marks on my arms, thin black lines that twisted and curled like vines. I stumbled through the house, my legs weak, my mind racing. Everything was in disarray. Furniture was overturned, the walls scratched as though by claws, and the front door was wide open, the lock twisted and broken. But the children were gone. Or so I thought. As I stepped outside, the morning light revealed something chilling. Etched into the wooden frame of my doorway, deep and jagged, were words that made my blood run cold. "We'll be back." I looked around, desperate for some sign of them, but the street was empty. The rain had washed away all traces of the night before, except for those words and the curse I now carried. The whispers began that evening, faint and fleeting, just out of reach. Shadows stretched too far across the walls, and the black marks on my arms spread slowly, their tendrils creeping closer to my chest with each passing day. They hadn't left. They were still with me, watching, waiting, and I knew deep down they would return. The days after that night were a blur, each one darker and stranger than the last. The black marks on my arms continued to spread, the thin tendrils winding their way up toward my shoulders and chest. At first they itched, then burned as though something alive writhed just beneath my skin. But it wasn't just my body. My mind felt fractured, as if pieces of my memory had been stolen, leaving behind empty spaces I couldn't fill. I'd catch glimpses of things that weren't there, small shadows darting across the room, faint whispers echoing from the corners. Then came the dreams. Every night, I'd find myself standing in the doorway of my house, staring out into the darkness. The boy and girl would be there, standing in the rain, their faces pale, their black eyes unblinking. They didn't speak in the dreams. They didn't have to. The weight of their gaze was enough to pin me in place, to remind me that they hadn't really left. One morning, I woke to find the words etched into my doorframe, "We'll be back," had changed. Now they read, "We're already inside." It was on the 5th day that I decided I couldn't stay in the house any longer. The whispers had grown louder, more insistent, sometimes calling my name, sometimes laughing softly in ways that made my skin crawl. The shadows no longer stayed in the corners. They stretched across the walls, flickering like flames in a breeze. I packed a bag, leaving behind most of my belongings, and drove to the nearest town. My hands trembled as I gripped the steering wheel, my rearview mirror reflecting nothing but the empty road behind me. Yet the feeling of being watched never left. The motel I checked into was cheap and run down, but it was far from the house, and that was all that mattered. That night, for the first time, I thought I might sleep without dreaming of those black eyes. But I was wrong. I woke with a start in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat. The room was dark, save for the faint glow of the parking lot lights seeping through the thin curtains. The air was still, but it felt heavy, as though the walls were closing in. And then I heard it. A soft knock. Not at the door to my room, but at the window. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest as the knock came again, louder this time. Slowly, I turned my head toward the sound. Through the curtains, I could just make out two small shapes, their outlines distorted by the thin fabric. "No," I whispered, my voice trembling. "Not here. Not again." The boy's voice came, soft and clear. "You can't run from us. You know that." I didn't answer. My hands clenched the sheets as my mind raced for an escape, any escape. The girl's voice followed, sharper, cutting through the silence. "It doesn't matter where you go. We'll always find you. I shut my eyes tight, willing them to go away, willing myself to wake up from this nightmare. When I opened them again, the room was empty, the window still and silent. But I knew better. The next morning, I returned to the town where it all began, desperate for answers. I visited the local police station, hoping to find some record of missing children, some explanation for what I'd experienced. The officer on duty, an older man with graying hair, listened patiently as I described the black-eyed children. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair, his expression grim. "You're not the first," he said. "We've had reports like this before. People seeing strange children, hearing knocks in the middle of the night. Most of them leave town soon after, or just disappear altogether." "Disappear?" I asked, my stomach sinking. He nodded. "Never heard from again. And those who stay, well, let's just say they're never the same." The officer hesitated, then pulled out a small folder from his desk. Inside were faded photographs of other people. People with thin, black lines etched across their skin just like mine. "They say the marks are a curse," he continued, his voice low. "A sign that the children have chosen you. No one knows why. But once you've seen them, there's no escaping it." I left the station in a daze, the officer's words echoing in my mind. The marks on my skin seemed to burn now, as if in response to the truth I'd uncovered. "I don't know how much longer I have. The whispers are louder now, and the dreams are bleeding into reality. Sometimes I catch glimpses of them in mirrors or reflections, always standing just out of reach. They said they'd come back, and I believe them. If you ever hear a knock in the middle of the night, if you ever see two children with pale faces and eyes as black as the void, don't let them in. Because once they choose you, they never let go."